Hello. Good afternoon from Washington. Good evening to others joining us across the globe. I am Dania Thafer. I'm the executive director at Gulf International Forum. We're excited today to have a panel discussion on a important and timely issue. The panel is titled Ukraine, 1 year on evaluating the Gulf's role. Um, so there's a lot of interesting things going on, um, and to give you a little bit of background about the issue, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine approaches its first anniversary, the Gulf states have played a variety of roles in the conflict, both directly and peripherally by providing drones and missiles to Russia. Iran has established itself as the Gulf region's most direct participant in the conflict. And it's the only country in the region whose leadership has openly sided with the Kremlin. By contrast, the GCC states uh, immediately condemned the invasion at the UN, and most have provided humanitarian aid to Ukraine over the past year. However, the GCC's approach to conflict has varied. While Kuwait and Qatar have vocally condemned Russia, the other four members of the bloc have been rather more reserved and cordial, if you will, towards Moscow. Much of the Gulf has continued to cooperate with Russia under the OPEC Plus oil alliance. Um, and, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have worked to organize prisoner exchanges between the two sides, buying goodwill in both Moscow and Kiev, and strengthening their soft power positions. Interestingly, actually, the news there's been some news coming out about Oman playing a mediation role between with Iran in reference to the war. And this is still kind of developing news. Constrained by geopolitical considerations, the Western nations have adopted somewhat of a nuanced approach toward the Gulf. In the days following the invasion, the United States and the European Union pressured the GCC states to condemn Russia at the General Assembly. And after they did so, the West largely refrained from heavy handed pressure on the Gulf to comply with sanctions on Moscow. Concurrently, Europe sought to increase its imports of oil and natural gas from the Gulf in order to offset sanctioned Russian hydrocarbons. However, OPEC Plus's decision in late 2022 to cut oil production, um, uh, 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 a number of Western officials vocally condemned the GCC states for their decisions. In the second year of the war, with both the military outcome and its global financial impacts uncertain, it appears the Gulf's importance in the conflict will only grow. This panel will seek to answer the following questions. What factors motivate the stances of the Gulf states towards the Ukraine war? Why have some nations condemned Russia and supported Ukraine more explicitly? Has anything changed since the start of the war? And how have the relations of the GCC states with Russia changed this last year? Can Saudi Arabia and the UAE preserve their cordial relations with Moscow if hostilities escalate? And how can the West and Russia encourage the Gulf nations to adopt Ukraine policy closer to their interests? We have an excellent lineup of speakers today. We have Dr. Cinzia Bianco. She's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Samuel Ramani. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Service Institute and a non-resident fellow with the Forum. And Eugene Chausovsky. Apologies if I messed up the last name. He is the Senior Director for Analytical Development and Training at the New Lines Institute. We're going to go ahead and start with Cinzia. Cinzia, can you talk about the Gulf states' perspective and on how the Ukraine war has changed or U.S. Gulf relations and Russian Gulf relations?
Sure. And first of all, let me thank you and the Gulf International Forum for convening this discussion. I think it's a very timely discussion. As you probably know, in Munich at Europe's most important geopolitical event, the Munich Security Conference, we're really discussing about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year later. And we really are making many different efforts, including with obviously the European Council on Foreign Relations, to sort of observe what has changed after a year, when obviously the invasion is no longer a blip, and how sort of preparing for what we call at ECFR the long war. And I think, I've been following the Gulf monarchies in particular, and their approach to the Russian invasion of Ukraine since the beginning. And I have to say, few things have changed after 1 year. It has now become quite clear in several Gulf capitals, GCC capitals, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has exposed the basically the unfitness, the lack of quality in the performance of Russian weapons, and basically the low level of the Russian defense industry. So we have seen a clear decline in interest from GCC capitals towards Russian technologies, in particular security and defense technologies, and sort of a double down on a long-standing preference for technologies coming from NATO countries. We have to say here that, interestingly, the United States diplomatically is trying to seize this sort of dissatisfaction and this negative momentum, if you will, for the Russian image as a strong nation, as a strong military power in the GCC, by also trying to make the case that other countries that use similar technologies or technologies that are similarly based on a common base from the Soviet era, i.e. Chinese security technologies, have to be considered similarly not as high performing as technologies from the NATO countries. And I have to say, I mean, this is getting some attention in the GCC. We know that one strong feature of sort of GCC interest towards Russia was Vladimir Putin's ability to project his own image as a strong man, as intervening in conflict and deciding those conflicts, really being a game changer on the military level, as well as then translating that military progress at the geopolitical level. And this was obviously a legacy of the Syrian war. When that did happen. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine obviously went in a very, very different direction. Having said that, there's still the same situation in terms of formally taking stances and taking a position. Only Qatar and Kuwait, as Dr. Dania mentioned, have taken a clear position on that. The other GCC monarchies have remained more ambiguous and cherish that strategic ambiguity. They really are, in particular the UAE and Saudi Arabia, playing the multipolar game. And it is very clear to me, having spoken to many interlocutors in both countries, that they think that this strategy will pay off, that so far it is not very clear to them, even after a year of isolation of Russia, it is not very clear to them that picking sides would be in their interest. And so they still very much refuse to do so. And they think they will be able to remain in this non-aligned position while playing the multipolar game for a while longer. That applies to Russia, United States, but also to the US-China rivalry. Interestingly, the Russian sort of weaknesses and the vulnerabilities and the isolation of, one of the most sort of comprehensive and tightest sanctioned regime ever, especially in contemporary history, has become in some cases also an opportunity for Saudi and Emirati investors. I mean, they are interestingly scoping out opportunities for investing in Russia, where obviously very interesting assets are now likely to be sold off at a much cheaper price. So there is this, some things have changed. In particular, the image of Russia has changed. And the idea that Russia being more than an actual player in the multipolar game, in more than an actual great power, is going to perhaps become a sort of ancillary player to another big power, which is China. But some other things remain the same, and that is, I would argue, that sort of extreme hedging that we have been observing since day one of the invasion. That hedging has just now been sort of translated into different domains. So, for example, as has been mentioned already, sort of using the refusal to align with Western sanctions as a way to play out and scope out a role for the GCC countries as safe havens from Western sanctions across the board. And I have to say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has provided an exemplary test case for the GCC monarchies to sort of sanction-proof their systems and to prepare for perhaps more trade wars to come in a way that allows them to carve out some space and remain those sort of safe havens for globalization, sort of reserves for globalization where it can still thrive and sort of be at its best. And I don't see that changing very much. And I will conclude by just saying I also don't see Western pressures ramping up that much on the GCC monarchies themselves in that space as well. I think Europeans in particular, they are still sort of figuring out perhaps even the utility, they use the sense of having spaces that are still remain places where you can trade globally, even with your enemies, and you can perhaps meet and have back-channeled conversations in the future.
Thank you, Cinzia, for that great overview and interesting points about the defense industry, and importantly highlighting the increased, I think, political maneuverability of the Gulf states since the onset of this war. So next, we're going to go on to Samuel. Samuel, if you could talk to us a little bit from the U.S. and Russian perspective, how has the Ukraine war affected their relations with the Gulf? And what do you think that Moscow or Washington want from the Gulf?
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dania, for convening this, and also to Cinzia for excellent initial remarks. I guess I'm going to be looking at the topics that Cinzia talked about, but from the other side of the coin, looking at how the great external powers, the United States and Russia, have viewed the situation. So, and this is a very interlocked topic. So let's start with how Russia has viewed the situation. Obviously, Russia has made it very clear from the start of this conflict that it's strategically reorienting its foreign policy away from the collective West towards a post-Western foreign policy. Senior officials within the Kremlin, like Dmitry Medvedev, Sergei Lavrov, Nikolai Patrushev, have very commonly and routinely said that Russia's goal in invading Ukraine is not just about taking over Ukrainian territory or about changing the regime there. It's also about overturning the existing U.S.-led rules-dominated international order and replacing it with a multipolar order. So overturning unipolarity and replacing it with multipolarity. And from that perspective, Russia views the Middle East, the Gulf region, as well as Africa, Latin America, and the Asia-Pacific regions as integral theaters of power projection. And it's seeking to move some of the diplomats, intelligence agents who have been kicked out from European and Western countries towards those leaders, as well as enriching and maintaining trade links with all of these particular regions. So that's where the Gulf fits in. The Gulf's importance for Russian foreign policy has never been higher, even if the Gulf's confidence in Russia's ability to at least be a decisive stakeholder, as Cinzia mentioned, or a military partner, is probably lower than it's been for a long time. So that's just an important initial point that I wanted to make about this. With respect to how Russia views the region, obviously its most central partnership and the partnership that's achieved the most significant headway has been Iran, right? Obviously, Russia has relied extensively on Shahed 136 and Mojahir drones coming from Iran, and now is allegedly trying to seek out the ballistic missiles from Iran. They may not be able to get the 700-kilometer range ones that they were hoping for because Iran wants to toe the line of the UN arms embargo, but they certainly have a possibility of getting the 300 kilometers smaller ones. So that's quite a significant shift that we're seeing here. Also, the Russian stealth technology has really not developed in a significant way, at least from their own indigenous production. And there's a growing feeling that drones could help decide this war, particularly with the Switchblades and the Bayraktars coming from the United States and Turkey, respectively, to Ukraine. So this has been a significant boost to Russia's military arsenal. And also stealth and missiles are both components of Russia's military arsenal that are relatively non-renewable, at least on a wholesale fashion, to be able to sustain a war of this scale. We've seen some evidence of domestic production of missiles being made in as late as August, being used on the front lines in civilian infrastructure strikes, but not of the quantity that would be depleted. So Iran has become an increasingly important security partner and very important for the Russians overall. They've engaged with the Iranians on also on de-dollarization and on combating sanctions, drawing upon Iran's extensive experience building a military infrastructure based on drones in large part too, and based on other tactics that would be able to circumvent Western sanctions, and also procuring Western-made parts, even when there were government-level sanctions on the Iranian regime. So Russia's involvement with Iran has strengthened and diversified in many different theaters as a security partner, as eventual almost a mentor-student relationship, where the Iranians are teaching the Russians how to get around sanctions, as well as on connectivity projects. So embracing Iran's closer ties to the Eurasian Economic Union, as well as the North-South corridor and other things. That's more illusory than the military and security objectives and sanctions objectives that we just talked about, but that's certainly there too. Obviously, though, Russia has been trying to maintain its friends with all, enemies of none, allies of none approach to the Gulf region, and has tried to make sure that its closer ties with Iran have not strained or derailed its ties with other Gulf countries. And while we've seen some periodic condemnations of the Russian procurement of Iranian drones from Gulf officials, there was one coming from Saudi Arabia back in late September. So it was just first becoming evident that they were getting this facility, talking about what a threat Iranian drones posed to broader regional international security. In general, the GCC countries have been remarkably muted and been remarkably silent, at least in public, about Russia's increased security cooperation with Iran, and certainly have not viewed it as an impediment to broader engagement. So overall, Russia's flexible diplomacy strategy of balancing between the Gulf monarchies and Iran appears to have held in this crisis much more effectively than during previous areas of disagreement, like when the Gulf countries and Russia were diametrically opposed on Syria, with Russia backing Assad and the Gulf countries wanting Assad removed, at least Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular wanting Assad removed. So that's just a general thing that Russia's been able to maintain its relationships. Obviously, Russia is looking towards the UAE as a very important economic partner because it sees the Dubai financial system as a valuable replacement for the assets that it's getting that it has in London, and also other theaters in the Asia Pacific region. So with even like Tokyo, Seoul, Taiwan, countries in the Indo-Pacific imposing tighter sanctions on Russia, Dubai is increasingly important as a hub for both Western and Eastern investments pouring in. That's significant. Maastricht Bank originally spooked Russia by saying that it was not going to process some additional transactions, but since then, Emirati financial institutions have been working with Russia according to plan. The Mir credit card system works. Non-oil trade has increased by 57% to $5.5 billion. And Russian real estate purchases in Dubai are really soaring through the roof. So this has been quite a successful adventure over there. And obviously, the Russians are courting Emirati investment in their own economy, as Cinzia said. And in particular, They're looking to see investments occurring in Muslim majority regions like Tatarstan. There were dialogues at the very high level between Rustem Minakhanov, the president of Tatarstan, and Emirati officials about making this a reality. And also investments probably in the hydrocarbon sector, though those have been a little less defined. Its goal with Saudi Arabia is very similar. It's really trying to court new investment coming in. Obviously, Al Walid bin Talal and Mohammed bin Salman's kind of joint initiative in February and March to invest in Gazprom, Lukoil, and Rosneft was a show of confidence in the Russian economy. But since then, unlike the Emiratis, who have engaged in more official, above-board public courtship of Russian investment, the Saudis have been a little more skeptical. There was even a statement coming from the Saudi PIF several months back, I think it was around September, saying that the focus is going to be, on green energy, alternative energy sources. We're not going to be investing wholesale in the Russian economy. And but obviously there's a hope, at least amongst Russian intellectuals. I would look at the work of Sergei Balsamov, who's a pretty prominent Arabist, who says that ultimately the Saudis are going to be worried that they're going to be isolated in the same way the Russians have. And the Khashoggi affair really spooked them with that. And that means the Saudis are not going to put all their surplus capital from high oil prices in the West. They're going to put some of it in non-Western countries, including in our hydrocarbon sector. So the Russians are hoping that that's going to happen. There really hasn't been that much of a change in Russia's relationships with the other Gulf countries of any significance, aside from perhaps now this new story that Dania just mentioned about Oman potentially acting as some kind of a mediating role in a crisis for the first time. Yeah, there hasn't really been a wholesale transformation from Russia's point of view. So in general, they're balancing effectively between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and they're viewing the whole Gulf region as much more important to their foreign policy vision because multipolarity now has to become a reality. It's not just a concept. So 25 years of talk that began with Evgeny Primakov now has to become the guiding principle of Russian foreign policy. And it's very unclear, at least in terms of investment and trade, that Russia can fully decouple itself from the West towards the non-West. And the initial teething troubles that we're seeing with investments from the Gulf coming into Russia appears to suggest exactly that point. So that's just what I want to see from the Russian overall point of view. The American point of view, very briefly, a few comments. It's quite interesting to look at how this is going. For the United States, obviously, they want to see a scenario where the Gulf countries are largely compliant with at least, if not imposing sanctions on Russia, not helping them violate sanctions. So we've seen Brian Nelson and other senior U.S. Treasury Department officials really needle the UAE about its role as a potential hub for Russian dark money. But the Emiratis so far have resisted that, much in the same way that Turkey has. But there hasn't been that kind of carrot and stick approach that we've seen with Turkey. Whereas with Turkey, there's warnings of sanctions and cutting off in the financial system if they act as a circumvention of trade. With the UAE, we're seeing strong warnings, but not really those punitive measures. And that might be a reason why the Emiratis really haven't followed suit. The other big issue is oil, right? Obviously, there's a desire from Western officials, ranging from German Economy Minister Robert Habeck to former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, urging these Gulf countries not to profiteer off of this, and also to work on increasing supply and trying to complement the campaign against Russia. But clearly, OPEC plus oil cuts that are done to increase prices right when Russia wants them, as well as the resistance from the Gulf countries to the G7 price cap, has clearly derailed any kind of cooperation in the energy sphere, and the Russians have noticed this gleefully. We've seen statements even from Sergei Narishkin, the intelligence chief, saying, well, Mohammed bin Salman doesn't listen to Joe Biden, he doesn't even take his phone call, and he certainly doesn't listen to him on oil. And that's something that they've been noticing very strongly. Aside from that, there haven't really been much changes in American posturing towards the Gulf on issues like Iran or Syria or other things that are that notable. The Americans did cave to the Saudis on giving additional Patriots because they were saying that they couldn't increase oil production because of Houthi drone strikes. So that doesn't seem to have really changed the tenor of their broader security engagement. And as Cinzia has noted earlier, the appeal of NATO-class weaponry is as strong as ever before. So even if they're displeased with the relationship that they're showing with Russia, they're certainly going to be looking towards the Gulf countries, the defense companies, and getting contracts and purchases. That's kind of how I see the situation overall.
Thank you, Samuel. That was very comprehensive and thought-provoking, and interesting points on the economic underpinnings between Russia and some of the Gulf states. So now we will move on to our third speaker, Eugene. And Eugene will talk about Gulf relations with Kiev. which is an interesting angle sometimes we don't hear enough about. Eugene?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thafer. And just wanted to say thank you to the Gulf International Forum for hosting this very important but also very timely discussion. So when we think about the question of what Ukraine wants from the GCC states, from the Gulf states, I think it's important to look at what Ukrainian President Zelensky has said himself on this topic. And perhaps some will remember, perhaps not, but just over 1 month after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Zelensky made a surprise virtual appearance at Qatar's Doha Forum back in March 2022. And he addressed the summit's audience and basically called on the world's leading energy producers to do their part to help Europe diversify away from Russian energy supplies. And Zelensky said that the responsible states, and he really singled out the state of Qatar, can contribute to stabilizing the situation in Europe, and that no state should use energy as a weapon and to blackmail the world. So I think this is where what Ukraine wants in terms of this energy diversification, given how dependent that Europe has been on Russia traditionally, it really actually aligns with what the West is going for as well. And we've seen in countering Russia in Ukraine, the US and the EU have made diversification away from Russian energy really a key part of their overall strategy against Moscow. And I think the thinking here is that this can both contest Russia's war efforts in Ukraine and reduce Russia's overall revenues, given how much energy plays into both. And we've really seen that over the past year, GCC countries have played an important role within this broader strategy. So when we look at something like diversification, Europe imported more oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait in the first 10 months of 2022 compared to the same period last year. And this is in the case of Saudi and UAE, it's even 3 times from the previous 3 years total. So clearly the oil supplies have been flowing to a much larger degree over the past year. And the same goes for natural gas. I mean, we've seen natural gas flows from GCC states to Europe increasing over the past year as well, especially from Qatar, who was the EU's second largest supplier of LNG after the US, and delivered 16% of their total LNG exports to the EU just in the first 10 months of 2022. We've also seen preparation for the future, with state firm Qatar Energy signing a 15-year deal with Germany back in November of last year to supply 2 million metric tons of LNG per year starting in 2026. And I think this shows the long-term ties between the Gulf's largest LNG provider on one hand and Europe's largest economy on the other. So really, we've seen the GCC states play a significant role in that energy diversification that both Ukraine and Europe have been calling for. But at the same time, we've seen that the Gulf countries have not fallen entirely in line with the West strategy or that of Ukraine. We've already heard from the previous speakers about how the Gulf states have, actually increased some of their economic ties with Russia. This includes increasing oil imports from Russia since the conflict began, and using some of that cheaper Russian oil for domestic use, while then increasing their own exports of their oil to Europe. We've also seen, and this has been discussed before, the resistance to alienating Russia from OPEC plus. We all know about the decision back in late 2022 to cut production against the wishes of the Biden administration, really showing that the Gulf states, go their own way on this. And this is really because I think despite Russia's decrease in oil production due to sanctions and cuts in supplies to Europe, it's still a major energy producer. And it still has, the Gulf countries still need Moscow's cooperation to stabilize prices in the event of any future oil price volatility. And this goes beyond energy as well. We know that Saudi Arabia is a significant arms purchaser from Russia. We've already discussed how the UAE has received a lot of Russian money inflows, targeting tourism and investment, money that was before going towards Europe, and now because of sanctions, it's finding itself increasingly in the Gulf. So really, this kind of goes to show how the Gulf countries have aimed to secure their own interests without throwing their full political weight behind either Ukraine in the West or Russia. But there is another important role being played here by the GCC countries, which has been touched on, and that's in terms of mediation and diplomacy. So rather than just pursuing opportunism and greater profits in response to the Ukrainian conflict, many GCC countries have actually leveraged their energy heft and broader political position to play a more active diplomatic role in the war. We've already talked about how Saudi Crown Prince MBS negotiated a prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine back in September. There was a much higher profile prisoner swap negotiated between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, between the US and Russia, which included the exchange of US basketball star Brittany Griner and Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. So I think these kinds of mediation efforts would not have been possible without the GCC states having solid working relationships with both Russia and the West. And just finally, to conclude, I think that this does point to the unique position that the GCC countries have. So refusing to sanction Russia and maintaining economic ties with Moscow gives them leverage with the Kremlin on one hand, just as their willingness to increase energy supplies to Europe gives them leverage with the West and with Ukraine. And I think moving forward, as we look ahead, this mediation role played between the GCC countries and Moscow, Kyiv, and the West could actually grow to become much more substantial in the future, including the possibility of mediating a settlement of the war in a broader sense, if and when that time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. And I see a theme here is discussing leverage. And there has been some changes in, I think, like I mentioned earlier, the political maneuverability of the Gulf states since the onset of the war. And actually, I would like to open the Q&A session with a question about if any of you have been following the Gulf, which I know you have, the rhetoric has changed a little bit, talking about the Gulf being middle powers, and certainly they have agency and are not client states, but the tone has really become more vivid about these points. Could anyone kind of comment on this and how it relates to the Ukraine conflict?
I mean, I will jump in to say that absolutely 100%. There is a sense of confidence that is very, very strong. And I alluded to that when I said, obviously in our conversation with GCC officials, we obviously want to explore the scope, the willingness, the comfort zone for the GCC capitals in this hedging game and in the multipolarity context. And I have to say their comfort zone is so far is quite broad. And I think it would be, it's necessary now to mention that, when in October, Saudi Arabia made that very strong decision of cutting back production of 5 million barrels of oil per day, that was an incredibly strong gesture, and that went directly against US interests that were clearly communicated to Riyadh. And the Saudi leaders made that decision partly because they had an economic rationale, but as many of you know, I've long argued that this was majorly, for the most part, a political decision. And it was a decision, in my opinion, to really show that confidence in resisting pressures, even from, the sort of long-time ally and security guarantor, still partially a security guarantor for Saudi Arabia, the United States. And then, from the US, we heard, also very disorderly threats of retaliation coming from different sides, a more measured language from the White House, more disordered language from, people in Congress and so on and so forth. But the reality is that nothing actually, there was no consequence at all for that decision. So you can argue, obviously, you can argue that decision, the Saudi decision to cut back production, was completely and entirely legitimate. Or you can argue that was not legitimate, and it hurt significantly Western or US interests, because it dented, for example, the credibility of the US as a great power. And then what you cannot do is sit somewhere in the middle. If you argue that that was a decision directly against US strategic interests and that the US will retaliate or will respond, then not doing that obviously strengthens even more the assumptions that already are quite strong in GCC capitals, that this is a golden time for playing the hedging game, and that there will not be consequences for playing that hedging game right now.
Thank you, Cinzia. Does anybody else, would anybody else like to comment on this point? Okay. How about we segue to Iran, because Iran has played a really interesting role. And it's interesting to see, to get an understanding of the EU stance towards Iran as things have changed. So now that Iran is viewed to have kind of malign foreign activities that expanded beyond the Middle East and now is into Europe, do you expect the EU to take a harder line on negotiations with Iran in reference to nuclear issues? Anyone like Samuel? Go ahead, Dr. Samuel.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that definitely we're seeing a paradigm shift, obviously, in the European Union's approach towards the nuclear negotiations, because even as recently as the early summer, right, the EU was really trying to make up for any kind of reticence coming from the Biden administration about that actually having a breakthrough in the JCPOA agreements, and it was kind of acting in concert with Qatar and other middle ground players in the Gulf region towards achieving that objective. But the entry of Iranian drones and now prospectively Iranian missiles into the battlefield in Ukraine has fundamentally changed that. And we're starting to see with Britain and the United States perhaps doing it more consistently and pronouncedly, but the EU following along, sanctions being imposed on key elements of the Iranian defense industry, and sanctions that will obviously remain in place, even if there is a deal on the nuclear issues, and that might not be acceptable to Tehran. So I think that we've seen a situation where the European Union, even if it is not in terms of its official policy, coupling and tying the nuclear issue to the to other extra-regional issues like what we're seeing in Ukraine, it in effect is tying it together much more closely than it ever did for Iranian policy in Syria, Iranian policy in Yemen, or the Horn of Africa, or other areas where there's destabilization. So that's a significant change, I think, from a policy perspective. Also, Iran's narrative and rhetoric and denials of drone deliveries to Ukraine have been to Russia, have been fully unrealistic. For example, the Iranians have come up with the assumption that they gave a small stock of weapons to Russia before the war, and those stocks are now being used. Clearly, it was evidenced by British and European intelligence agencies that the Iranians actually gave a second tranche of drones to the Russians as recently as early December. So the Shaheeds were very active on the battlefield in Kiev, Odessa, other cities in October into late November. There was a brief hiatus, and that hiatus was because of resupply. And now that the Iranians have kind of been proven to be inaccurate in their rhetoric and also are engaging in more overt means of cooperating with Russia in the security sphere, like the production of a joint drone factory and the presence of Iranian technical advisors in Crimea, it's really, really much harder for the Iranians to claim even a veneer of plausible deniability about this that would create ambiguity for nuclear negotiations. So I think that more than any other extra-regional issue, the issue of Iranian involvement on Russia's behalf has been coupled to the progress of the nuclear talks to a great extent, and the EU can no longer really reliably act as that kind of middle ground between the American and Iranian positions that could help bring about a renewed deal. So that's why I think that the prospects for a renewed deal are now very unlikely in 2023, at least as long as the Iranians continue to back Russia militarily.
If I could just add, onto what Sam said, I think, Iran is one of the few countries that have overtly pushed their support behind Russia, along with other countries like Belarus or North Korea. It's not a large list, essentially, of countries that have, very formally assisted Russia in the war in Ukraine from a military perspective. And then we get the kind of results, from the standpoint of the EU, and of the US that was just mentioned. And on the flip side, kind of to speaking to Cinzia's point before about the greater leverage now for these more middle powers like the Gulf countries, because they have not thrown their weight behind Russia or really the West, but they kind of act within their own interests, sometimes to the benefit of one, sometimes to the benefit of others. That actually puts them in a much stronger position and kind of explains why we've seen the lack of a major reaction, from the US, for example, on that OPEC decision to cut supplies. So it really goes to show how much benefits there is to having that degree of maneuverability that the Gulf states have opened for themselves, in contrast with that of Iran.
Excellent. So I want to segue into a developing issue, and I know it's kind of just, I think, came out in the news yesterday or today, about mediation. I know, Eugene, you mentioned some points about mediation in your discussion. So the emerging Iran-Ukraine dialogue that's being, I guess, hosted by Oman, which is interesting because I think many people have assumed that Oman would not take on this sort of role again, based on its previous experiences in mediation. And so I wonder if anybody has read into this or has some points they'd like to make about Oman's foreign policy interests and the Ukraine Russian war.
I think if you allow me, Dania, I want to sort of share some thoughts that we've aligned on this issue. I mean, the sense we have is that by talking to people who were aware of the process, is that there is some reluctance to see that as basically a stalling technique from the Iranians. And the Omanis, as you were saying, Dr. Dania, they have significantly scaled down their willingness to be exposed on the front lines as mediators. They now much prefer to talk of themselves as facilitators, and they have clearly decided to focus on narrower specific issues, such as, for example, prisoners exchanges in Yemen and other sort of specific issues where they are absolutely clear that there is, from all sides involved, all sides that they facilitate discussions for, there is a green light. And this is a relatively uncontroversial issue because, as you have mentioned, the Omanis have paid a high price for being on the front line of mediating the JCPOA. That's why this role is now with Qatar. But obviously they still have the capabilities and capacity of being facilitators. And when they are asked to do so on specific issues, and there is sort of no resistance from the great powers and the players involved, they do that happily. So I think in this case, they have received a clear green light from other Western capitals as well, in terms of going ahead and seeing sort of what's in this conversation. But there is also a clear reluctance to, from many sides, to see this as basically really a stalling technique. We know the Iranians negotiate like that often, and they use all sorts of this, sort of calling for more dialogue and for more negotiations to buy time for themselves. I think there is a small realization in Tehran that supporting Russia militarily has really completely changed, as Samuel was saying, the perception of Iran in all of the European capitals, even more so than the European Union, even more than in Brussels. This is really about, Berlin and Rome, and to a certain extent Paris. So I think there is that idea of, let's call for more negotiations and more dialogue to buy some time for ourselves. And sorry to be cynical, but sometimes you need that.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with that. Cinzia's points on this, and just to kind of add a little bit more to the what I've seen about the Oman story, is that yeah, basically what it looks as if was that Oman was hosting Iranian and Ukrainian talks, particularly about the issues of drones and missiles. At those talks, with regards to drones, it seems as if the Iranians presented the case that I said earlier that they'd given these drones to Russia before the war, and now they're being used. The Ukrainians obviously came with a lot of more documentary evidence and put it in the Iranians' faces that that they've been kind of using these drones throughout the war repeatedly. And so it obviously did not really produce much in terms of consequences or substance, but it's indeed notable that the Iranians and the Ukrainians do want to engage in dialogue on this issue because Iran tried to present itself during the early stages of this war as something of a mediator, a potential mediator between the Russians and the Ukrainians, or at least a country that could straddle both sides. So we saw in the early stages of the war dialogue between Lavrov and Kuleba, and even Kuleba from the Ukrainian side asking the Iranians to serve as a messenger of sorts towards the Russians to stop and end the war. And I got this also when I was interviewing Iranian ex-diplomats and Iranian academics for my forthcoming book, Putin's War in Ukraine. They were talking very similarly about this, that Iran was trying to position itself as some kind of an alternative constructive de-escalation force. But by September and October, I noticed that even Iranian academics and diplomats, their rhetoric has shifted on this, and they were saying that Iran's all in on the Russian side, and that this mediation talk is really just a facade. Off the record, they were saying things like this. So it appears as if the Iranians want to at least maintain a public face that they're willing to engage with Ukraine, and they're somehow not as tied in with the Russians as they actually are. And that's where Oman became convenient and useful for them as a forum, as a trusted forum, for them to be able to have these kinds of negotiations and talks. And speaking to also what Cinzia said earlier, Oman does not want to be on the front lines of conflict diplomacy. It doesn't want to do the role that it had in the JCPOA. It doesn't want to try to do what Turkey's been doing with regards to hosting the Black Sea grain export deal or hosting the major Russia-Ukraine talks like we saw in Istanbul. Instead, it prefers to work in the shadows. It prefers dialogue facilitation. It prefers to do something along the lines of what we've seen the Saudis and the Emiratis do with regards to prisoner exchanges, or with the Viktor Bout exchange, or the Azov Medvedchuk exchange, And they have experience with that too. They've done prisoner exchanges in Yemen. They may be able to apply that experience down the road in the crisis in Ukraine. They may be able to engage with both sides or other actors like Iran that are auxiliary to the conflict in a dialogue facilitation role. It's interesting to note that the Omanis are now trying to establish and expand their diplomatic presence in Ukraine, and they also have a track record of cooperation and dialogue with Russian security organs and Russian security institutions. And that's because Oman was the only Gulf country not to sever or drastically downgrade its relationship with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and that won a position of trust. And we saw also the Russians view Oman as the gateway to selling their collective security program for the Persian Gulf, which was aimed to remove foreign forces. They used Oman as the country that they were engaging with. And Sergei Naryshkin, for example, engaged with Omani officials in late 2019 and then publicly again in early 2020 about these very issues. So Omanis have got deep-seated connections at the diplomatic and security level between both Russia and Ukraine that they might use in a facilitation capacity or even emulate the Saudi Emirati approach with prisoner exchanges. So there's an Iran dimension here, and there's also a broader foreign policy dimension here that's quite interesting.
If I could just add one kind of point to all these very rich answers, I would say that from a mediation perspective, I don't quite see this Omani mediation between Ukraine and Iran quite to the same degree that we've already talked about other Gulf mediation efforts. So whether that's talking about the prisoner exchanges that the UAE and Saudi have conducted, or even as Samuel mentioned, the Turkey's role in terms of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Those were leading to concrete, even if it's not at a strategic level, but very tactical measures that mediation produced. In this case with Oman, given that Iran is, as we talked about before, more of a party to the conflict rather than just kind of an innocent bystander, even if it maintains that it provided these drones to Russia, before, and it wasn't intended to be used in the Ukrainian conflict, I don't think that same level of mediation can apply in this context, but perhaps more so for getting clarity on that relationship. I know that Iran, obviously coming under some political pressure due to protests in the country, that Iran's role in with Russia against Ukraine is not a particularly popular issue amongst the Iranian people for the most part. So I would kind of just distinguish between those mediation efforts. But overall, it does show kind of how, from different angles, Gulf states have become more and more important in mediating in the war and its various ripple effects as well.
Yes, indeed, mediation is an interesting tool for asymmetric power, and the Gulf states have been playing roles not only in this conflict, but in other disagreements and conflicts globally. And at one point, the GCC states showed some of the GCC states showed interest in purchasing the S-400. Do you think that's out of the question now? I know, Cinzia, you touched upon their interest in military equipment from Russia.
Yeah, I'll let I have sort of shared my view, so maybe I'll let Samuel or Evgeny come in on this.
Yeah, with respect to the S-400s, I think that these negotiations were already on ice even before this current war began, and even before the inefficacy of Russian military technology was proven. I mean, it seemed as if in 2017, when the Saudis agreed to purchase S-400s, it was and that they pledged $3.5 billion, that there never was really a concrete payment plan or schedule for delivery. It wasn't like the Turkish deal or even the Indian deal that we're seeing unfold right now. And it seemed as if it was kind of a means of pressuring the United States to give the THAAD systems to the Saudis. And it was not a coincidence that days later, the Americans pledged the THAAD. So the Saudis were the one country that was really interested in terms of signing a memorandum on the S-300s, and they didn't really work. The Emiratis never really pursued the S-400 in a very vigorous way. They did obviously have experience using Pansirs, but those Pansirs were overpowered by Turkish drones in Libya. So the appeal of Russian air defense systems for them had already diminished before the war. And the same thing with Qatar. I mean, Qatar was pushing in this direction during the blockade when they felt under threat. And the Saudis went to Macron. Mohammed bin Salman, of course, went to Macron and asked the Russians not to deliver it to the Qataris in a moment of panic. But it appeared as if the Qatari dialogue on S-400s with Russia were never really that serious. It was more aimed at kind of sending a signal to the Saudis and the Emiratis that they had external partners and that they would be able to procure weaponry that could be very irritating for Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, rather than actually really wanting to buy it. So I think that the S-400 issue was kind of already extinguished before the war started, and now I think it's almost certain not to happen. We really haven't seen very aggressive Russian marketing of military equipment and arms to Gulf countries. There was that one incident at the Riyadh Defense Expo at the start of the war, or in early March, where the Russian Rosaborn export and the Ukrainian arms vendors had booths next to each other, both trying to market arms to the Saudis. But that produced no outcomes, and it looks as if any non-Western country is getting into the Gulf markets, is probably going to be China in some way, and not the Russians.
Thank you, Samuel. So let's go ahead into closing remarks. I'll give each one of you a minute or two to kind of say any points that you feel you forgot or you remembered in our discussion. Usually that happens when one speaks about an issue, or something you think that would bring this talk home. We'll go ahead and start with Eugene.
Sure. Well, I just want to say, thank you once again for hosting this discussion. It's been really enriching and learned a lot. I don't have much to add beyond what was already said. I think just from the standpoint of how we've discussed, the maneuverability, this unique role played by the Gulf countries in that they have, relationships with both Russia and the West, and they're unlikely to break, completely in either direction. And so I would just say, from sitting where I sit here in Washington, D.C., if I could make the recommendation from a policy perspective for the U.S., I know that it's been a major effort by the U.S. and the EU as well to try to isolate Russia. That's a key component of their strategy, in addition to supporting Ukraine, obviously from a military and political perspective. And while the latter has obviously led to some benefits and to some results, with Ukraine making some progress on the war effort, the former, isolating Russia, has proven to be much more mixed and complicated. And so I would just suggest that the U.S. treats this issue with kind of a degree of nuance, not trying to isolate those countries that fall outside of the pro-Western or pro-Russian paradigm. And that's especially important in the case of Gulf countries, which are, as we've discussed, major energy providers to Europe. That gives them a lot of breathing room in terms of their efforts to fight back against Russia, so to speak. And then look for ways to cooperate constructively. That can include offering technology, offering a guidance on the green energy transition, which even as fossil fuel exporters, the Gulf states will be playing a key role in terms of everything from renewables to solar, wind, things of that nature. So I think pursuing kind of a more practical and more constructive relationship with these countries will ultimately be in the best interest of the U.S. and of the West, and for Ukraine overall as well.
Thank you. Good points. Let's go to Cinzia.
Thank you. So I want to close by reiterating sort of a point that I have alluded to in the first remarks. From a European point of view, the way that we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine is certainly with less sort of anxiety, arguably, than a few months ago. There is a different sense of confidence in the Ukrainian ability to push back the Russians, even to the entirety of the Ukrainian territory. There is a different confidence in our own ability to absorb the energy shock, the shock in terms of energy security, inflation, and cost of living. There is, I have to say, just a different feeling in Europe in terms of our ability to sustain the long war and support for Ukraine until victory. And I think that sort of as also obviously impacted the way that we look at how the global South or simply other countries not directly involved in the conflict have positioned vis-a-vis the conflict. Certainly, in geopolitical terms, it goes in European favor that that there is in the Gulf now a clear sense that Russia may be very easily lose this war. That's very different from the beginning, when most GCC capitals thought that Russia would win this war very quickly. However, it's very important to remember in the United States and in European capitals that the ideological point of view, viewpoint in the GCC hasn't changed. That the geopolitical victory of the West, or sort of better position of the West, would not necessarily translate into a closer ideological alignment between the GCC capitals and sort of Western point of views. There is still a very wide and deep distance there, and there is very much an inability of agreeing and converging on ways to look at the multipolar world and just balance of power and international relations overall. And this is really important to remember, I think, because that ideological, that philosophical even distance is here to stay and will resurface in other instances of multipolar conflict. For example, if there were tensions escalating between the US and China, or in other cases. So that's really easy to sort of neglect that when you feel a bit safer, but it's really important that we don't do that. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're going to go to our last, but certainly not least, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you, Cinzia and Eugene and Dania, for the opportunity to do this. And it was a great discussion. And just to make a final point, I just wanted to make the point that the U.S. is very unlikely to be able to really change the course of the Gulf countries, the Saudis or the Emiratis in particular, away from this kind of middle ground between Russia and Ukraine, because this multipolarity and this middle ground policy is something has a long historical context. The UAE, for example, even during it dates back probably several decades. Like even during the 1980s, it's important to keep in mind that while the Saudis were arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the UAE and Oman were establishing diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1985 and 1986. And they were very receptive, obviously, to the overtures that came from Eugene Primakov. They engaged with Russia against the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 in terms of dialogue. And on past Russian military interventions, we've seen a very similar policy of compartmentalization. So in Georgia, we saw Prince Bandar from Saudi Arabia even acknowledge or express some sympathy for the Russian invasion of South Ossetia. And no countries really take steps to isolate Russia, again, after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where they voted one way in the UNGA to condemn Russian activity and Russia's annexation, but engage with Russia in a relatively business as usual fashion. The only thing that prevented it from getting much larger was the issue of Syria. And that was really only an issue temporarily for the Saudis and the Qataris. So my point is that this multipolar game, as Cinzia said, I think that's a good phrase to describe it as, that we see happening and unfolding in the current Ukraine war is something that's been 30 or 40 years in the making for many of these Gulf countries. And the United States is not going to be able to impose either co-option or coercion to pull these states away. And Russia is fairly confident, too, that's going to be able to remain a pull, even if a diminished one, in these countries' foreign policies. That's just an important general point to make out, that what we're seeing happen over the past year with the Ukraine war is nothing new. It's a combination of large-scale trends, and it really reflects the continuity of how Gulf countries have approached Russian military interventions in the past inside Europe, with the obvious exception of the internal conflict in Chechnya, which was a conflict against the Islamic world, and that's where we saw Gulf monarchies funding rebels and other things. But in European security crises involving Russia, what we're seeing here is just a continuity, and it's a long story that's likely to endure no matter how long this war continues.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists today for this very enriching discussion, looking at the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war from the perspective of the Gulf, and also Europe and the US. And let's hope maybe by next year we won't be having this conversation again. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. And we look forward to other future events on timely issues. Take care.
Thank you.